It was a late October night, one of those bitterly cold ones where frost clings to the edges of the road, gleaming under the sparse moonlight. Joel had been driving for hours, watching the clock on his dashboard tick toward midnight. The road stretched endlessly ahead, winding through dense, dark forest, with only the occasional road sign or speed limit post flashing in his headlights. It was so desolate, he hadn't seen another car for at least 50 miles. This particular stretch of highway was isolated enough that his phone lost signal 2 hours back. As he drove, Joel noticed the thickening fog, blanketing everything outside his windshield in a swirling mist. His visibility dropped, but he was too far from anywhere to pull over. He slowed down, gripping the wheel tighter, and leaned forward, squinting into the mist. That was when he saw it. A figure shuffling along the side of the road, nearly invisible against the fog. Instinctively, Joel slowed down even more, his heart hammering in his chest. His headlights caught the figure for a brief moment, and he could see it was a woman, hunched over, wearing a tattered dress that clung to her gaunt frame. Her hair was long and tangled, hiding her face as she took slow, deliberate steps. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to drive on, but something pulled him in, some strange compulsion to see if she needed help. He rolled down his window slightly as he approached her. "Do you need a ride?" he called out, his voice trembling. She didn't look at him. She didn't even seem to hear him, her head bowed, her pace unchanging. He drove a little ahead, stopping his car directly in her path, and turned on his emergency lights. Joel had barely opened his door when he heard her soft, haunting voice, raspy and strained, muttering words he couldn't make out. Against every bit of reason, Joel took a step toward her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. Her voice was a repetitive, eerie whisper, and the words finally reached him. "They're coming! They're coming! They're coming!" She didn't raise her head, didn't acknowledge his presence, just kept muttering as if he were invisible. He shivered, a chill running through his spine. In the distance, he thought he heard another car, a faint hum of an engine, so he glanced back down the road. But when he turned back toward her, she was gone. Panic surged through him as he looked around. She couldn't have moved that fast. He'd only looked away for a second. The road was empty. The trees were silent. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air. Joel's hands trembled as he climbed back into his car, slamming the door and locking it, as though that would keep whatever was out there, out there. The silence was pressing, broken only by his own heavy breathing. As he continued down the road, his mind raced, replaying the eerie encounter over and over. His nerves were on edge, and he found himself glancing in his rearview mirror more often than he wanted to admit. Each time, he half expected to see her sitting in the back seat, her head down, whispering those same words, "They're coming. They're coming." 15 minutes passed, and the fog had thickened into an almost impenetrable wall. He slowed down further, barely able to see more than a few feet ahead. Then, suddenly, he saw something else up ahead. A car, flipped on its side, headlights dim, smoke rising from the engine. Joel pulled over cautiously, heart pounding. The crash looked recent, yet there was no sign of any other vehicle on the road. He climbed out of his car, his flashlight in hand, and approached the wreck. "Hello? Is anyone there?" he called, his voice shaking. He got no response. Peering through the shattered window, he saw the inside of the car, a mess of broken glass and twisted metal, but no one was inside. Confused, Joel took a step back, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Just as he turned to head back to his car, he heard it again, that same familiar whisper. "They're coming, they're coming." He spun around, scanning the darkness, his flashlight beam trembling in his hand. That was when he saw her, just a few yards away, standing perfectly still, her face shrouded in hair, her head tilted downward. This time she was closer, much closer. Her whispers filled the air, louder now, and he could hear the words clearly. "They're coming. For you." Joel's blood ran cold, every instinct telling him to run, to get back to his car and drive as fast as he could. But he was frozen, trapped in the woman's dark, unblinking gaze as she slowly raised her head. Her eyes were empty, hollow, her face pale and gaunt, like someone who'd been lost for years. The corners of her mouth twisted into an unnatural smile as her hand reached out toward him. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over himself, and bolted to his car. He locked the doors and started the engine, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the keys. Just as he looked up, he saw her standing directly in front of his car, staring at him through the windshield, her lips still moving, whispering those cursed words. In a blind panic, Joel floored the gas pedal, swerving around her, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to look back. The fog lifted slightly, and for a few brief minutes he felt relief as the road seemed clearer, the night less oppressive. But the reprieve didn't last. As he glanced in the rearview mirror, he felt his heart plummet. She was there, in the back seat, her eyes meeting his through the mirror, her mouth moving silently, chanting the words over and over again. "They're coming! They're coming!" With a scream, Joel slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop. He threw open the door and scrambled out of the car, breathing heavily, his chest tight with terror. The road was empty. She was gone. The mist thickened again, enveloping the road, and he could hear only the faint rustling of leaves in the cold night air. Joel stood there, alone on the deserted road, too afraid to get back in the car, too terrified to keep walking. The silence around him was so profound, it was as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then, from somewhere deep in the fog, he heard it, the low hum of an engine, distant but growing closer, accompanied by a familiar whisper on the wind. The last thing he saw as he turned to face it was the flash of headlights cutting through the fog, and the pale figure of the woman, standing in the middle of the road, her empty eyes staring right at him, her mouth still moving, still chanting. The road through Gray Hollow was a lonely, winding stretch that cut through the woods like a scar. Nobody with good sense traveled it after sundown, not with the stories that hung over it like fog. The locals said the place was cursed, that once you were on that road at night, you'd find yourself driving for hours in circles. They said people had vanished there, swallowed up by the dark woods that loomed over it. But Liam was new to town and dismissed the tales as superstition. He didn't believe in curses or ghosts, and after all, it was just a road. It was a little after 11 when he found himself on Gray Hollow, a mist drifting over the trees, twisting and rising as he made his way through the dense forest. He didn't think twice about it at first, just shrugged it off as an ordinary fog. But then he noticed the silence. There wasn't a single sound outside. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the soft hum of his car's engine as it cut through the unnerving stillness. Liam glanced at his GPS, frowning as the screen glitched, jumping between coordinates. He was sure he'd taken a left turn where he'd meant to take a right, but no matter how many turns he made, the road remained unchanging, endless. Minutes stretched on, then hours, and the road began to twist in ways that defied reason. It seemed to loop back on itself, bending at odd, impossible angles. The trees leaned over the road in twisted, unnatural shapes, their branches curling toward him like reaching hands. It was then that he noticed the shape in his rearview mirror. A silhouette of a man, standing in the middle of the road, backlit by his own taillights. Liam glanced away, thinking his eyes were playing tricks, but when he looked again, the figure was still there. It was moving, a slow, shuffling step forward, its face obscured in shadows. He gripped the wheel, breathing hard. He'd driven 100 yards away, but the figure hadn't disappeared. Instead, it seemed to be closer, standing in the middle of the road just a few car lengths back. Liam pressed the gas pedal harder, speeding down the narrow road, but no matter how fast he went, the figure was still there. Always at the same distance, always moving forward. His headlights began to flicker, and the fog thickened around him, almost smothering. As he sped, he heard something strange, a faint tapping from the back seat. His heart raced as he dared a glance in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. He turned his gaze back to the road, feeling his skin prickle with unease. The tapping grew louder, becoming a slow, deliberate knock. He forced himself to look in the mirror again, and his heart froze. The figure was now inside the car, sitting directly behind him. Its face was blank, hollow-eyed, with skin so thin it seemed stretched over bone. The figure stared, its mouth twitching into a thin, unnatural grin. Panic overtook him. He swerved the car, hoping to throw whatever it was off balance, but the figure remained unaffected by the violent motion. He slammed the brakes and stumbled out of the car, breathing heavily, hands shaking. The road stretched out into darkness, silent and still, the fog creeping in tighter around him. And then he heard it, a faint, dragging sound like someone moving slowly toward him. He turned, squinting through the fog, trying to see. His headlights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows. And then he saw it. The figure from the car, standing not 10 feet away, its head tilted, mouth moving in a low, guttural whisper. "They're coming for you." He stumbled back, too terrified to even scream. The figure stepped forward, one slow, dragging step at a time, as Liam's body locked in place, his mind screaming for him to run. But he couldn't, his legs wouldn't move. He was frozen, helpless as the figure drew closer, its voice a hiss that filled the air around him. In his peripheral vision, he saw shapes moving in the fog, other figures, just like the one in front of him, surrounding him, closing in. They whispered in unison, a low, haunting chant that filled his ears. "They're coming for you. They're coming for you." As they closed in, their eyes hollow and endless, their whispers filled his mind, drowning out every rational thought. The last thing he saw before the fog swallowed him was their twisted smiles, wide and empty, as they reached out to drag him into the darkness that clung to the cursed road. Maggie had been driving cross-country all week. She was exhausted, running on black coffee and gas station snacks, but she was almost home, just a few hours left to go. The clock on her dashboard read 2:13 a.m., and her eyes felt heavy, so she decided to take the back roads to stay awake. It was a gamble, but she hoped the twists and turns would keep her focused. She had no idea just how wrong that decision would turn out to be. The road grew narrower, and the trees on either side grew taller, casting deep, twisted shadows across her car. The radio began to sputter with static, so she turned it off, leaving only the hum of her engine and the crunch of gravel beneath her tires to break the silence. She felt something strange about the air around her, thick, oppressive, almost like she was driving underwater. She glanced in her rearview mirror and saw nothing but blackness, and as though her taillights were being swallowed up by the night. Then she saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road up ahead. A man, or what looked like a man, was waving his arms slowly as if signaling her to stop. His clothes were torn, hanging loosely on his frame, and his head was tilted at an odd angle. Against her better judgment, she slowed down just enough to get a closer look. He didn't seem to have a face, just a smooth, blank expanse of skin where his features should be. Maggie's foot hit the gas, and she sped past him, heart pounding, refusing to look back. A mile down the road, she started to relax, her mind convincing her that it had just been a trick of the fog, a shadow, or some other logical explanation. But then her headlights picked up movement again, another figure standing on the side of the road. This one was different. It was smaller, like a child, and she could have sworn it was wearing a white dress. The figure raised its arm and pointed straight at her, its face hidden by a mass of dark hair. She drove faster, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, but the road seemed to stretch on forever. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that something was moving in the darkness just beyond her vision. She kept glancing in her mirrors, expecting to see that child, or maybe the faceless man, standing in the back seat. After what felt like hours, her headlights illuminated a large hand-painted sign on the side of the road, "Last stop for gas." Relieved to see any sign of life, Maggie pulled into the dimly lit station. It was old, the paint peeling, and there were no other cars around. The windows were dark, and the air smelled stale. She climbed out, took a deep breath, and went to pay the attendant. The station was silent, almost unsettlingly so, until the door creaked open, and an older man with tired eyes stepped out, wiping his hands on an oily rag. "Fill her up," he asked, looking her over with a strange intensity. "Yes, please. And is there a faster route back to the main road?" "I think I took a wrong turn," Maggie said, her voice shaky. The man's expression darkened, and he glanced down the road she'd come from. "There's no turning back once you've started down Grayfield Hollow. This place, it has its own rules." His words sent a chill down her spine, and she shifted uncomfortably. She was about to laugh it off, but his eyes were so serious, almost haunted. Maggie decided not to ask any more questions and handed him cash. As he pumped the gas, she caught movement in her peripheral vision. Across the street, just barely visible in the dim glow of the station lights, stood the faceless man. His head tilted as if listening, though he had no ears, no eyes. She blinked, but he remained unmoving, watching her without watching. "You all right, miss?" the attendant asked, snapping her back to reality. I think I'll be fine," she stammered, quickly climbing back into her car. She tried to calm her breathing, clutching the steering wheel as if it would anchor her. She sped away from the gas station, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. But the relief didn't last. A mile later, she saw another figure on the side of the road. It was the same child pointing again, only now there was a smile, a wide, twisted grin that didn't belong on a child's face. As she sped past, the headlights illuminated another sign that made her blood run cold. Last stop for gas. She hadn't realized she was gripping the wheel so tightly until she felt her knuckles ache. She looked to the side, recognizing the gas station, the same peeling paint, the same flickering lights. Panic set in. Somehow she had driven in a circle. She pressed her foot harder against the gas pedal, speeding down the road, desperate to escape. But the woods grew darker, more twisted, the road narrowing until it was barely wide enough for her car. She glanced in her rearview mirror, and this time, her worst fear came true. The faceless man was sitting in her back seat, leaning forward, his head hovering just over her shoulder. His skin was stretched, too pale, his hands resting on either side of her headrest. In a raspy, hollow voice that sounded like the creak of old wood, he whispered, "You can't leave until you're one of us." Maggie screamed, swerving off the road and into the trees, her vision blurring with tears. She slammed the brakes, jumped out of the car, and ran blindly into the forest, not daring to look back. She could hear footsteps behind her, slow and steady, following her through the trees. She ran until her lungs burned, her body ached, and she stumbled, falling to the ground. As she lay there, gasping for breath, she looked up and saw them standing in a circle around her. The faceless man, the grinning child, and others, all with hollow eyes and twisted expressions, watching her, waiting. In the dim light, she saw her car, still idling on the road just a few yards away. She stood, ready to make a break for it, but then she saw her reflection in the driver's window. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, her mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. Maggie never left Grayfield Hollow. Ethan had driven the same road 100 times. He was used to late nights on the road as part of his delivery job, traveling long stretches of empty highway. This particular road, Route 46, had always given him an odd feeling, but he shrugged it off. It was the only shortcut back to his town, saving him an hour of driving, so he never thought twice about taking it. Until tonight. It was just after 1 a.m., and the road was unusually dark. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and even his headlights seemed dim, barely cutting through the shadows that swallowed the road. After a while, he noticed that the usual landmarks, mile markers, signs, and the occasional street lamp, were missing. The highway was empty, only stretching out into blackness with no familiar signs in sight. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine, but pressed on, convincing himself it was just another long, quiet drive. But then his radio crackled to life, loud static erupting from the speakers. Startled, he reached to turn it off, but before he could, he heard a voice. A woman's voice, faint and distorted, crackling through the static. "Turn. Back." The words were barely audible, a soft, eerie whisper that sent chills down his spine. He looked at his radio display, but it was blank, and no other stations seemed to be coming through. His fingers fumbled to turn it off, his heart racing. Just as he silenced the static, something flashed in his rearview mirror. A car was behind him, its headlights faint, flickering in and out like a candle. Ethan squinted, trying to make out the car's make or model, but it was too far back, just barely visible. He drove a bit faster, assuming it was another late-night driver on the same route, but as he sped up, the car behind him did too, maintaining a constant distance. Ethan's grip on the wheel tightened. He tapped the brakes, hoping the other car would pass him, but it didn't. Instead, it stayed at the same eerie distance, its headlights flickering with an unsettling rhythm. He pushed harder on the gas, but just as he reached the bend in the road, the radio crackled to life again. This time, the woman's voice was clearer, urgent, and chilling. "Turn back. Don't let him catch you." His stomach twisted as a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He wanted to pull over, to stop, and gather his wits, but fear kept his foot on the gas pedal. The headlights in the rearview grew brighter, closer, until he could almost make out the driver's silhouette. But the features were strange, distorted somehow. He looked away, keeping his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Then he noticed something horrifying. His surroundings had changed. The trees on either side of the road were unfamiliar, their branches twisted and leafless, clawing at the night sky. The asphalt looked cracked and broken, as if the road had been abandoned for years. And worst of all, he couldn't remember seeing any of this before, not on Route 46 or any road he'd ever traveled. Ethan's pulse quickened. He turned his head just slightly, glancing back at the car behind him. The driver's face was more visible now, and his heart skipped a beat. The face was stretched, too pale, with empty, hollow eyes that stared straight ahead, unblinking. The mouth was open in an unnatural, twisted grin, wide enough to look almost inhuman. Ethan nearly veered off the road. He tore his gaze away, desperate to ignore the twisted face in his mirror. Just then, his radio clicked on again, louder than before, the woman's voice a frantic whisper. "You can't outrun him. He'll follow you until you're his." As the last word echoed, he noticed the road splitting up ahead. A faded, rusted sign appeared in his headlights, pointing left. The sign had no writing on it, just a faded arrow pointing down a narrow road that seemed to disappear into thick darkness. Without thinking, Ethan veered left, hoping to lose the car. The narrow road was rough, barely wide enough for his truck, with trees crowding close, their branches scraping along the sides like bony fingers. He couldn't see the car anymore, and for a brief moment, he felt relief. Maybe he'd lost it. But just as he started to slow down, a loud, metallic scraping echoed from behind him. He glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The car was back, and this time it was right behind him, close enough that he could see every terrifying detail of the driver's face. The figure had no real eyes, only black holes, and its mouth was twisted into a gaping, silent scream. Its hands gripped the wheel with fingers that looked too long, stretching and wrapping around it like claws. Panic surged through Ethan, and he floored the gas, his truck roaring as he sped down the narrow road. But the other car kept pace, its headlights now shining so brightly that they nearly blinded him. The road twisted and turned, but the figure was relentless, following him at every turn, its empty gaze fixed on him. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the road ended. Ethan slammed on the brakes, his truck skidding to a stop inches from a deep ravine. He threw it into reverse, but the other car was gone. He glanced around, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. In the silence that followed, the radio crackled one last time. The woman's voice, soft and mournful, echoed through the cab, barely a whisper. "It's too late. You're his now." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He turned around slowly, and there, sitting in the passenger seat, was the figure from the car. It looked at him with empty eyes, its twisted mouth pulling into that horrific, wide grin. Before he could scream, the figure reached out and everything went dark. The next morning, Ethan's truck was found abandoned on Route 46, parked neatly on the side of the road. There was no sign of him, only his phone, left open to his last text to a friend. It read, "I think I'm being followed. Someone's trying to catch me." No one ever saw Ethan again. But sometimes on dark nights, drivers on Route 46 report seeing an old truck parked along the road. Inside, they catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure in the driver's seat, staring out with empty eyes, waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to pass through. It was after midnight when Lucy took the shortcut home. She'd just finished a late shift, and even though she usually stuck to the main roads, tonight she was too tired to care. The shortcut was an old winding road that cut through dense woods. No one used it much, and she figured she'd be home 20 minutes sooner. She'd heard the rumors about strange things happening on that road at night, but she laughed them off, thinking they were just campfire stories to spook kids. The night was unusually quiet, and her headlights seemed to barely penetrate the thick darkness pressing in from all sides. Tall, ancient trees flanked the road, their twisted branches arching over her like bony fingers. The air was heavy, thick with fog that had appeared suddenly, hanging low and suffocating. Her car radio crackled with static, so she turned it off, leaving just the low hum of her engine and the crunch of gravel under her tires. Then she noticed it, a figure on the side of the road, standing still as a statue. She slowed down, squinting through the fog. It looked like a man, but something was off. His back was turned to her, his head tilted at a strange angle, almost too far. She could make out long, unkempt hair, and his clothes hung off his frame, too loose, as though he were little more than a skeleton draped in fabric. Against her better judgment, she slowed down as she passed, trying to get a closer look. Just as she passed, the man's head snapped toward her, his face expressionless but his eyes piercing, dark and hollow. Lucy gasped, her heart racing, and sped up. She kept glancing in her rearview mirror, expecting to see him following her, but the road remained empty. She laughed nervously, shaking her head. Just a trick of the light, she told herself. A few minutes later, she noticed something strange. The road in front of her looked exactly the same as it had when she'd first seen the man. She drove for several more minutes, but the surroundings didn't change. She began to feel like she was driving in circles. Her phone had no signal and the GPS was glitching, refusing to load the map. As she glanced up from her phone, she spotted something in her rearview mirror. It was the same figure, the man from the side of the road, but now he was closer, standing directly behind her car, staring at her. Her pulse quickened. She slammed on the gas, but as her car sped forward, the headlights seemed to barely cut through the fog, and everything around her grew darker, thicker. Then the road forked, splitting into two paths. There were no signs, no indication of where either path led. She didn't remember a fork on this road. Taking a shaky breath, she veered left, hoping it would lead her out. She drove faster, keeping her eyes glued to the road ahead, but after a few minutes, she felt an overwhelming urge to look in her rearview mirror. The figure was there again, but this time he wasn't alone. There were others, shadowy figures standing close together, faces pale and blank, their eyes wide and hollow. They were watching her, their heads tilting in unison, their mouths forming twisted smiles. Heart pounding, Lucy gripped the wheel, pressing the gas pedal as hard as she could. She kept her gaze forward, refusing to look back. Her mind raced, trying to remember how long this shortcut was supposed to be, but she felt like she'd been driving for hours. The road seemed endless. Suddenly, her headlights illuminated a sign on the side of the road. Welcome to Pine Hollow, population 0. Lucy's stomach dropped. There was no town called Pine Hollow near her. She glanced to the side and saw abandoned buildings just beyond the trees, houses with shattered windows, leaning precariously as if they were on the verge of collapse. The entire town was shrouded in fog, an eerie stillness hanging over it. Her instincts screamed at her to turn around, to find her way back to the main road, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the figures would be waiting for her there. Just as she was debating her next move, her car sputtered. The engine coughed, stalling, and her headlights began to dim, flickering in and out. No, 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 she muttered, frantically turning the ignition, but the car wouldn't start. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. She reached for her phone, but the screen was blank, no matter how many times she tapped it. She felt the prickling sensation of being watched. She dared a glance in her rearview mirror. The figures were standing even closer now, crowding around the back of her car, their blank faces pressed against the glass, staring at her with those empty eyes. One of them lifted a hand, tapping on the window with slow, deliberate movements, each tap echoing in the silence. "Leave me alone," she screamed, fumbling to lock the doors, but the figures didn't move. Their faces remained pressed against the glass, their eyes following her every move. She tried the ignition one more time, and miraculously, the engine sputtered to life. She didn't waste a second. She floored the gas pedal, tearing down the road, not daring to look back. But as she sped through the fog, she noticed something horrifying. No matter how far she drove, the figures never left her rearview mirror. They seemed to be inside her car now, their faces inches from her, filling every inch of glass with their haunting, hollow gazes. One by one, they began whispering her name, soft and sinister, the sound filling her ears until she felt like she might go mad. Then she saw it up ahead, a bright light, like a street lamp, cutting through the fog. She pressed harder on the gas, desperate to reach it. As she drew closer, she realized it wasn't a street lamp at all. It was a cross, an old, weathered wooden cross standing by the side of the road, illuminated by a faint glow. She screeched to a halt in front of it, her heart hammering. The figures had disappeared, but she could still feel their eyes on her, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. She stumbled out of the car, her legs shaky, and approached the cross. Her eyes fell on the words carved into the wood. "Turn back before it's too late. There's no escape from Pine Hollow." Her heart dropped as she looked around, the silence pressing in. She was completely alone, or so she thought. When she turned back toward her car, she froze. The figures were waiting for her, standing in a ring around the car, their eyes fixed on her. They stepped forward, slowly, one by one, until they surrounded her, whispering her name in voices that sent chills through her bones. The last thing she heard was their hollow, collective voice, a dark, echoing murmur. "Welcome home, Lucy." The next morning, a passing driver found her car abandoned by the side of the road, empty. They reported it to the police, but Lucy was never found. And to this day, those who take that shortcut at night say they sometimes catch a glimpse of a ghostly figure on the side of the road. A woman, standing alone, staring with hollow eyes, her face twisted into an endless, silent scream.